Hi, this is Parish President Cynthia Lee Shang. Our parish is working very hard to reduce flood risk for you. We're confident that many of our upgrades, newly accredited levees, completed drainage projects, and upgrades to our pump stations keep you safe from flooding. But the reality is that we live in Southeast Louisiana, and many of our buildings and our structures and our streets are below sea level, resulting in an ever-present risk of flooding. All of the buildings are at risk, regardless of their flood insurance designation. We want to encourage everyone to purchase flood insurance to protect your investment. Here's some frequently asked questions, and we encourage you to talk to your agent about your flood insurance options. And for more information about flood risk, see jeffparish.net/flood.
What does base flood elevation mean?
It has to do with how high the water would get at any given location. So oftentimes you'll look at the base flood elevation for your location and you may see that it is at a -3.5. A -3.5 base flood elevation, you're like, what is that? How can I have a negative depth of water? That's in relation to sea level. A lot of areas here in South Louisiana, especially in Jefferson Parish, have negative ground elevation. So the ground around my house may be at a -5, 5.1. So if the ground around your house is at a -5.1, and then the base flood elevation is a -3.5, the difference of those is 1.6, and that's 1.6 feet difference between the two. So 1.6 feet of floodwaters would potentially happen in a 100-year, 1% annual chance of flooding.
Why is my flood insurance rate different than my neighbor?
There's a lot of different ways that a property can be rated, but most of it has to do based on your flood zone. When you're in a flood zone AE, there's two main ways that your property can be rated. The first is with a subsidized rate, and the second is with a full risk rate. The flood zone X often goes by how many floods your property has experienced and not specifically on things such as your base flood elevation.
So we're often asked, I have my elevation certificate, but I don't really understand what the numbers mean. Some of the more important numbers to look at is the lowest floor in your base flood elevation. One example could be that the lowest floor is -1.1 with a base flood elevation of -3.5. Well, that difference gives you 2.4 feet, or when rounded, a +2 to show your full risk. So when you relate that to the rate maps, you'll see that insurance would cost approximately $515. Now, if you take that same calculation but show that on the new maps, your base flood elevation is decreasing to -4, then that calculation becomes the lowest floor of -1.1 subtracted from the base flood of -4, and that gives you a difference of 2.9 feet, which translates to 3 feet above the base flood elevation. And then that savings on the rate table would bring you to an insurance premium of approximately $440. So now let's look at your neighbor across the street who's not elevated. Their lowest floor is -4.7 and the base flood's -3.5. The difference is -1.2 feet, or -1 feet below the base flood elevation. When you look at the rate tables and what that means for full risk, you're looking at approximately $3,300 in your insurance premium. But when the new map goes into effect and that base flood elevation is decreased into -5, let's look at the calculation again. -4.7, the lowest floor, subtracted from the base flood of -5 would give you a difference of a +2.8, which when rounded comes to 0, or at the BFE, the base flood elevation. This is now considered a compliant structure, and the insurance rate will be $1,500, which is a savings of approximately half off.
Is a Zone X a no-flood zone?
X zone properties have just as much of a chance as flooding any given day as the property that is in a higher risk flood zone. The depths may be less, but there's also the idea that a flood map creates a boundary line, and flood depths and flood waters don't always respect those boundary lines that are seen on maps. Based on information from flood insurance, nearly 20% of the claims in the United States made annually are from properties in a flood zone X.
What can be done if my flood zone or base flood elevation is increasing on the new map?
If you do not currently hold a flood insurance policy, it is definitely recommended that you speak with your flood insurance agent now. See if you have the ability to purchase insurance now as a Zone X and potentially have a lower rate than if you wait until the new map goes into effect and you would be required to buy flood insurance at that higher AE premium rate. One other idea, if you're in an area that is getting a negative effect from these flood insurance maps, is definitely to consider a mitigation project, either to check with the floodplain management office to see if you would be eligible for an elevation grant or potentially a reconstruction grant, and also see if there are any drainage projects in your area.